So we could conclude here that China followed the fate of India, that slow corrosion of Mughal authority, that as Europeans began to penetrate the system. Once again, there are many trajectories through global history. Not all regimes have to conform to some universal law. We saw how the Japanese responded one way to the ways in which the globe was shrinking, the Mughals responding another way. Well, one would think that China would follow the Mughal course, and in fact, they don't. For the new dynasty that was created in China in the wake of the Manchu invasion gave rise to a new cycle of imperial expansion under the Qing dynasty, which would run from 1644 to 1911. Nonetheless, you have to appreciate the depths of the crisis that would bring the Manchus to power in Beijing. China was still, in many respects, the world's superpower at the time, suffering from immediate catastrophic economic effects and mayhem, from climate change to demographic collapse, people fleeing estates, agrarian output plummeting, reversing the cycle of agrarian expansion that we saw earlier, food prices soaring, bread riots, and so forth. It was an era of social crisis. Epidemics spreading, afflicting the most vulnerable populations, reversing the process of that southernization of the Chinese settlement frontier. Remember the Pearl River Delta that I mentioned earlier, which was, in a sense, one of the locuses of the expansion of population, settlement, economic exploitation. The Pearl River region population had reached 12 million by 1644, but so severe was the crisis that by 1661 the population shrunk to 10 million. So we could characterize this age as one of enormous discontinuity in China. That would lose sight of some important continuities. In some respects, the way the Manchus overtook the Ming dynasty turned the Chinese inwards, not unlike what we see happening in Japan at the same time. The majority Han population of China, now ruled by a small minority of Manchus, turned towards themselves, turned inwards to try to reestablish a notion of Han ethnic purity. All of this was reinforced by early practices of the Qing conquistadors led by Gao Zhang. The Qing needed advisors to build their new regime and often turned to ethnic minorities to establish their rule. So as the new conquistador sought to consolidate his new power in Beijing, the Manchu ruler, and it would take him 40 years to establish his rule, leading to widespread military campaigns across the south and southwest of China to bring the remnants of the old Ming power into the new Qing system. It spurred the Han to look again to themselves, to identify with this now, this ethnic majority ruled by minority outsiders, and to turn to certain patterns of scholarly orthodoxy, a return to classical studies, lambasting the laxity and the openness of the late Ming authorities, especially their model of new Confucianism that I talked about earlier in the lecture, and the culture of consumption and relations with foreign powers and the objects they brought with them. In the end, though, the Qing did consolidate their dynasty. They would impose an important dress code that would be the characteristic of their regime. The straitjackets of the Qing would be one of the hallmarks. The shaved forehead was extremely important for the kind of code that they tried to get the Han to conform to. And as you might imagine, this only intensified the abrasive relations between the Manchu and the Han. Well, one way that the Qing had to try to build some legitimacy as minority governors and a majority Han people, one resource that they had was, once again, to turn to the peripheries, to open up new lands for Han farmers, or for farmers to discover their identities and perhaps create new loyalties to the Qing rulers. One way to do this was to turn once more to Chinese frontiers. This happened to dovetail with the ever-present concern for border security. So, to establish some system of security in the north and the west, what the Manchus did was initiate a series of military campaigns to establish some mastery over Central Asia. This, of course, would bring them eventually into a headlong collision with the other major power that was trying to establish its presence in the inner worlds of Asia, which was Russia. There would ensue then a very complicated struggle between Russia and China over the interiors of Asia, with the tribesmen, the Mongols, and the relics of the old Khanate kingdoms increasingly squeezed between these power holders. Let's call this amalgamation of Khanates and kingdoms and Mongol warrior regimes, in a sense a holdover of an earlier era. Let's call these borderland peoples and their kingdoms now under threat from these territorial empires. The Qing trying to reestablish their mastery. Russia imagined now as a great new player on the global stage, now being squeezed. It would lead to the crushing of the last of the Khanate kingdoms that started out our course, the tribal states of Mongolia. Let's end this lecture with the story, the tribulations of perhaps one of the last of them all, led by a man called Choros Erdenin Galdan, who lived from 1644 to 1697, and he would be the victim of this expansionist urge of the Qing. He was part of the last remaining Buddhist state from the steppe lands to the Himalayas like Tibet. And the Manchu armies would set their sights on Galdan's forces and try to hunt him down. But in order to do this, in the interiors of Eurasia, the Qing had to organize massive armies and extended supply lines to convey the troops to these hinterlands, using horses, donkeys, and oxen. Eventually, the armies would parade out of Beijing into these hinterland territories. But one after another, these expeditions actually failed. And it was really not until the emperor would lead the final excursion himself in 1691 that we see the campaign finally drive Galdan into his last hamlets. For months, in preparation for the emperor's own expedition into Turkestan, where Galdan had taken refuge, Months of preparation went into it. Tens of thousands of carts were filled with fuel, munitions, food. Beasts of burden were brought from around the Chinese Empire to prepare for this great expedition. But because the supply lines to get from Beijing all the way to Turkestan were so long, entire divisions had to be prepared just for the conveyance of the supplies to wage the campaign. When the troops finally walked out of Beijing, entire divisions carrying supplies to the hinterlands, 8,000 horses were carrying 300,000 bundles of grass, 1,300 carts of food, itself a convoy. This epic expedition of 1696 turned into a chase across the Gobi Desert, with guerrilla wars scattered across the steppes, forests, and deserts of Central Asia. With mass bombardment of hamlets, village relocations, in some respects this war looked an awful lot like the kinds of systematic wars we're going to see against villagers in the 20th century. In the end, Galdan's only hope was to draw, his only hope for survival was to draw the Manchu forces so far into the interior that they would starve and their long supply lines would be vulnerable to guerrilla assaults. That was not a bad gambit if you think about it, but his forces by then were simply too small and too outnumbered by the scale of the Manchu armies. His allies deserted him or were bought off by the Manchus until finally Galdan was surrounded with just a handful of troops left. Many of them committed suicides or were killed by their lieutenants. We're not sure. Galdan's own body was found. The body itself was transported back to Beijing. And part of the transportation of Galdan's body to Beijing was a massive ceremonial parade to exemplify the power of the Manchus over subordinate peoples, particularly in the hinterlands of China, and to celebrate Manchu heroism. Chinese writers would be deployed to write great epics of the triumph, dances, public political acts to trumpet the power of the Qing dynasty, highly choreographed performances and ceremonies. In all of this fanfare, with very political purposes, the dynasts issued a set of public pardons to show the rulers charity, magnanimity, and mercy over his subjects. Also to show the ways in which he could enforce justice and bring justice to other peoples. In the end, Galdan's body was held out, not just as an emblem of the defeated peoples, but held up and desecrated, sliced up in public, so that his very presence, his physical presence on this earth could be eradicated. An elaborate ceremony was held in the military training grounds of Beijing, where the emperor summoned thousands of Manchu, Mongol, and Chinese leaders to watch, literally, as Galdan's bones were brought out in a procession, one by one, each bone crushed in public. The dust from Galdan's bones scattered to the winds, so that Galdan would only survive in the official memory that would be inscribed by the official epic writers of the Qing court. And so it was by 1700 that China rejoined the race to occupy the race for the shrinking open spaces of the world.